I, I kindly ask Jeff Lee to welcome all participants.
Thank you. Thank you, Giovanna. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry my Italian is not it's not there at all, in all honesty. I wish it was, always been my problem. But let me just say thank you very much to ISSUP Italy and colleagues and the eminent presenters that we have this afternoon on this very important subjects. And as we have World AIDS Day in Italy, I was just saying to Giovanna before we started that the Italian individuals as well as organizations are playing a very important role in helping us achieve our mission as ISSUP in trying to promote a professionalized workforce that can promote evidence-based practice and policy, high quality, ethical work in how we go about our drug demand reduction in prevention, in treatment, and in recovery support. And it's been tremendous how ISSUP Italy is playing a key role in helping us build our expertise and to share our message internationally to try and promote an international response to what is an international issue. And ISSUP, both globally and within its national chapters, which we now have 34 national chapters around the world, are beginning to try and make a difference and are making a difference in promoting the way we go about our work in drug demand reduction. I'm going to say very little other than say thank you. Thank you to colleagues in Italy and ISSUP Italy for all they've done to make this happen today. Thank you to the presenters for giving their time, their commitment and support, and their expertise in what are very necessary and fascinating subjects where I certainly will be watching the recordings that will be available after, even though I can't say all this afternoon, and I look forward to picking up later on. And just to say, we hope you will join ISSUP and become a member. We have now almost 30,000 members around the world, and we hope that by becoming a member of ISSUP, you'll become part of that family, of which ISSUP is a key family member. ISSUP Italy is a key family member. I hope you have a very enjoyable afternoon. And on behalf of ISSUP Global, thank you very much for being here. I hope it's worth your while. And thank you so much to those people who are presenting this afternoon. Thank you, Giovanna.
Jeff, thank you so much for this important welcome address, which starts our scientific session today. Before getting to the core of the webinar, I'd like to ask our president at Casa Rosetta to take the floor and greet us all. Thank you. I'll do it with great pleasure. It's a great honor and pleasure for me at the opening of this webinar to say a brief greeting to the directors of the ISSUP, distinguished speakers, Professor Cauda and Professor Sani, and the participants who will be following this meeting remotely from various countries. I'm Giorgio De Cristoforo. My greeting and thanks to all of you as a president of Casa Rosetta Association, which for almost 40 years, starting from here, from Caltanissetta in the center of Sicily, has been involved in the treatment, care and prevention of pathological addictions, as well as neuropsychomotor rehabilitation for people with disabilities and residential care for people with various difficulties and conditions. Casa Rosetta has also been a national chapter of ISSUP Italy for the past 3 years, and in this role has promoted today's event on the occasion of the International Day for the Fight Against AIDS and HIV. We wanted to organize a day for an update on the evolution of the pathology and treatment and to reflect on aspects that are not only medical. AIDS issues have been a strong focus of Casa Rosetta for more than 20 years. The association, among other things, has in Caltanissette and Partenico near Palermo two residential communities housing people with AIDS. Almost all of them are people who, after various painful life experiences, had no other condition for a dignified existence or even for not living in the streets. Our experience is very close to the theme of this year's International Day: Equalize, equality against the social stigma, equality and access to care for all globally. We hope that today's meeting will offer insights of interest and personal enrichment and useful elements for our future activities. Our wish is to fight stigma and let the youth understand that risk behaviors can be the source of harm. We do hope, as I was saying, there be personal interest and enrichment. Our wish, which indeed is a certainty, given the scientific authority and international prestige of Professor Cauda and the high competence of Professor Sani. With these sentiments, I wish everybody a fruitful participation and extend the cordial greetings to each one.
Grazie Presidente per il tuo saluto.
Thank you, Giorgio. Thank you, Mr. President, for renewing the availability and willingness to host ISSUP Italy chapter for the coming 3 years. The Memorandum of Understanding will be signed by December. I would also like to thank all the team of ISSUP Italy. I'd like to thank also the steering committee made up by national and international experts in the treatment of substance use disorder individuals. This committee, promoted by Professor Pina Franzica, we created together with JET, cooperates on the ISSUP Italy website. I'd like to take few minutes to provide some information, general information on ISSUP. ISSUP has more than 27,000 members and 33 national chapters worldwide. Each new meeting with the national chapters with other country in the world or from the world, which becomes a national chapter and is part of this large family. ISSUP operates in the field of prevention and treatment of substance use and in the psychosocial recovery of people with pathological dependence. The aim of this commitment is to connect professionals, researchers, and experts through a network that guarantees the exchange of knowledge and continuous training, sharing an ethical approach based on scientific evidence and promoting quality in all areas of prevention and rehabilitation practice. Just 2 days ago, there was an international meeting of the 33 national chapters organized by Livia Edgar, the Vice Director, whom I thank for her ability to bring together experts from all over the world. If you not have already done so, I invite you to visit the ISSUP.net and ISSUP Italy websites, where you can find information on how to become an active member and participate in the international network. The website is full of training material, information, and publications for free consultation. Briefly, before starting the webinar, I would like to give you some information on participation. You will have the opportunity to send your questions to the speakers by typing them into the dedicated area of the webinar platform that you see on your screen. You can send your questions at any time during the presentations. Our team will collect them and answer them in the question and answer session at the end of each presentation. Now I'd like to introduce the other participants who, together with speakers, will be participating, and they introduce the presentations and they will manage the questions and answers. Dr. Mr. Rosario Cigna, sociologist and lecturer in general sociology at the university degree course in education and training sciences at Casa Rosetta Istituto Don Sorce. He's an expert in AIDS-related issues, given his many years of experience as director of the accommodation communities or outreach communities for people with HIV/AIDS, the president was mentioning before. Casa Rosetta has been running these outreach communities since the 80s, both in Sicily and Tanzania. He will be joined by Dr. Enrico De Cristoforo, communication expert, pedagogist, as well as journalist, a member of the ISSUP Italy communication team, will be helping us to manage the question and answer session in the first and second presentations, and then at the end as well. Thank you so much, Enrico. Together with them, Peter Cipolla, member of the board of directors of Casa Rosetta, supports us in all the activities of ISSUP Italy, as well as many other international activities, by supporting Casa Rosetta in all cooperation projects. I kindly now ask the floor. I give the floor actually to Rosario Cigna, who's going to introduce today's speakers, Professor Cauda and Professor Sani. Thank you. Thank you, Rosario. Thank you, Giovanna. I'd like to welcome all participants to this webinar. I'd like to thank the ISSUP team, the organizers, and President Mr. De Cristoforo. This year's topic is Equalize, which is promoting equality, the fight for inequalities. And today is the World AIDS Day. As we can see from the catchphrase, it's a call to action related to emergency if we really want to eradicate AIDS soon, as the United Nations refer to for sustainable development. Casa Rosetta since 1991 has been feeling the need of emergency. In Caltanissetta, the outreach community for individuals with HIV and AIDS was then created. In those years, even though today the percentages are different, there was a close connection between heroin use and HIV infection. Villa Sergio, which is the outreach community for AIDS individuals was a sort of connection to the outreach community for drug addicts because it was hosting a high percentage of HIV individuals. In 1994, a second community was created in Partinico near Palermo. Our spearhead in 2005 was the creation of a community in Tanzania to host children with HIV, to guarantee access to treatments, good diet and food. So the first data which we could see as outstanding. These qualities slow down the fight against AIDS. This is the alarm that the program of the United Nations has been launching. Data focus on the fact that because of COVID, advances against the pandemic have undergone a strong slowing down of available resources, and as a consequence, millions of lives are still at risk today. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce and thank the first speaker. I'd like to thank him for having accepted to speak in this webinar. I'm speaking about Professor Roberto Cauda, professor at the Agostino Gemelli Hospital and at the Cattolica University in Rome. He's an expert of infectious diseases and he's going to speak about the connection between AIDS and COVID. This is a situation we experienced in our communities where there was some outbreaks in the Caltanissetta and Partinico community centers. We are seeing another phenomenon, the comorbidity between HIV, AIDS and psychiatric disorders. On this topic, Professor Gabriele Sani is going to speak. He's a professor of neuroscience at the Cattolica University in Rome. Well, most of our individuals in the community are followed by the unit for infectious diseases and experts in mental health, also by the services for drug addiction, where several of our guests are administered methadone because they had drug addiction condition. Professor Sani is going to speak about symptoms and psychiatric disorders of people abusing or using substances. The problem of AIDS is there, but thanks to antiretroviral medications that could be kept under control, but there are other weaknesses in our centers as far as these individuals are concerned. I'd like now to give the floor to our first speaker, our friend Professor Cauda, who's going to speak about the challenges of AIDS after COVID-19. Professor Cauda, you have the floor. First of all, thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. It's an honor for me to be a friend of Casa Rosetta. This morning I spoke with Giovanna Garofalo. We got international guests, and I'm going to switch into English.
Let me say initially that I am extremely glad and grateful for this invitation to this international webinar. I have been invited several times, I was mentioned in Italian, in Casa Rosetta in the past year before the pandemic, and I had the great privilege to meet Father Vincenzo Storch, a person I will never forget. The many initiatives he has undertaken in his life still remain in Sicily, in Tanzania. Let me add that we send our student, when I was the director of the International Center of Solidarity of my university, we have sent students in this place in Tanzania, and the feedback was extremely good. Let me say that all my life, or the great part of my life has been marked under the sign of AIDS, HIV. Initially in the 80s, when I was working in the US, and when I came back in Italy, up to now, I face almost daily with this problem. The World AIDS Day is a time when we think to the past, we say something about the future, and we describe the present. We now are in a double pandemic, I would say, because HIV and AIDS has been a dramatic pandemic, and the title of my presentation will be, I don't know how to go ahead with my slides. That apparently doesn't move. Oh, here. We are facing two different viruses. The viruses are quite different. HIV is a retrovirus. It needs the help of the cells to replicate. SARS-CoV-2 is a new virus which has probably appeared in 2019, and we will see in a moment when this has happened. We consider now probably the serotype, the presence of different virus, and we know that we have two families. One is the original virus, which has started one, has immediately changed, and I was among the group who has described this change in Italy. It has not been called the Italian variant, but the mutation D614G has appeared in Italy, and this initial family, this blue family, is related very strictly to the one original virus. In range, there is the so-called Omicron soup. This virus has many mutations, and we should consider this as a different virus. In a provocative way, some virologists has introduced and proposed to call Omicron SARS-CoV-3 because it's extremely different. First of all, has a higher transmission. We started with zero of Omicron of 1 between 2.4 and 2.6. It says the first wave caused by the Italian variant D614G increased to 3, Alpha 4, 5, Delta 5, 8, but Omicron is 10 and probably more. It's very similar to mumps and measles, especially the new variants of Omicron, the one named Cerberus or Griffon. Omicron is present in almost every country. There is a delay between one slide and the other. This is something that I cannot manage. What are the major differences of Omicron in respect of the the other variants, the so-called pre-Omicron variant. The prevalence for the upper respiratory tract infection, which means that Omicron is much more transmittable than the other variants. Omicron has a decreased ability to infect lung tissue, and this tells us why COVID-19 caused by Omicron produce less pneumonia and more upper respiratory tract infection. And also the animal models indicate that clinical signs are connected with a less severe disease. The topic of my presentation is HIV and COVID-19. Dr. Cigna has brilliantly introduced these dual infections that we have seen several times in our patients, especially in close community, as the one that are related to Casa Rosetta. And I will try to cover the outcome in people with HIV, how works the vaccine in people with HIV, and what lesson we have received from for COVID-19 from HIV. I just must say that the data that we presently have are not confused, but there is not a unique data or unique results, probably because there is a case mix of data and regarding the patient, how the patient with HIV present, if they are immune suppressed or if they are not immune suppressed. This is a very summary of what happened when a virus enters in a human being, and there is the mucosal infection, the transmission in gut-associated lymphoid tissue, which is close to the gut, to the intestine, reach the lymph node. There is a microbial translocation at the level of the intestine, an important damage of TCD4 positive cells, which produce immune deficiency, which is responsible of the AIDS progression, which can be stopped by the highly active antiretroviral therapy. In those patients, in the natural history, it was common to see the opportunistic infection and the opportunistic neoplasm, and there was also an important immune activation. If we look at COVID-19, at least with the pre-Omicron variant, there was the entry of the virus, the possibility of replication in the nasal epithelium, and this is something that we have to consider very carefully, the ACE2 receptor. The ACE2 receptor, which is present in the nasal epithelium, in the epithelium of several mucosa, but most important, is present in almost all organs of our body. So this can explain why the infections with coronavirus is a generalized infection and cause a generalized disease, which involve not only the lung, which initially were the primary target of the infection, but also the nervous system, the central nervous system, the cardiovascular, the heart, and the cardiovascular system with the presence of thrombosis, and the kidney, the liver. Almost all the skin, almost all organs can be affected by this infection, and SARS-CoV-2 has a tropism for every cells of our body. Just to tell you what happened, there is a viral attack, an immune activation similar to what occur in HIV, and this hyperinflammation is common in persons living with HIV and COVID-19. This is just a long list of the possible microbial co-infection in COVID-19. We have co-infected virus, co-infected fungi, co-infected bacteria. And let me just say that especially during the first wave, the first peak of these infection, the one which occurred during the lockdown in Italy between March 9 and June 2020, sorry, there has been a dramatic usage in the hospital, and not only in the hospital, of antibiotic. We have a side effect of this, the increase in multi-resistant drug bacteria that will remain for a long period of time. All the cells are involved, especially the cells which play an important role in the immune defense, in the immune system, the macrophage, the cytotoxic cell, the regulatory cells, and the helper cells, and the cells which promote the non-specific cytotoxicity. You see there is an overlap between the cells which are decrease or increase. It depends on the circumstance, between person living with HIV and severe COVID-19 patients. This is a summary. I have no time to get too much in detail or in deep in this slide, but we have epidemiological issues. For example, the disruption to HIV prevention and treatment service has been already mentioned by Dr. Cigna in his introduction. Clinical issue, a possible worse outcome in co-infected individual, the impact in terms of mortality and morbidity, the interference with the preventive campaign, and we will see there is a very interesting slide which derived from a published survey done during this pandemic, and the fact that the big question is whether or not, at least at the beginning, there were two questions. One, are HIV subject living with HIV, person living with HIV, eligible to vaccine? And the debate was probably the immune depression does not favor a positive response. And the second question was how this is the priority for this vaccination. And all these two questions has been positively answered. These are the clinical outcome, and especially the proportion of patients presenting these symptoms. And the symptoms are not particularly different in terms of percentage if we compare person living with HIV and person without HIV. Fever and cough, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, were present in higher proportion. There are comorbidities. We know that one important issue is the presence of comorbidity, and the presence of comorbidity either in HIV positive or HIV negative person can determine a different outcome. Hypertension, obesity, hyperlipemia, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and can make the difference in terms, the age can make the difference in terms of the worst prognosis. It's also important to mention that an asymptomatic status can occur, and paradoxically is quite common among hard-treated persons with HIV. Now there is a series of studies which are in apparent contradiction, because we will see studies in which HIV play a negative role in terms of prognosis, and other in which HIV is not so detrimental for the prognosis. Most of these studies has been derived from trial conducted in South Africa, and we know, as been already mentioned, that in Africa the access to universal treatment is not as good as in the other part of the world. In these studies, which has involved almost more than 250,000 patients hospitalized in South Africa, there has been an increased risk of severe and critical COVID and an increased risk of in-hospital mortality. These are data from WHO, and has been produced by Silvia Bertagnolio. Let me say that she has worked with me, and she had obtained her specialization in infectious disease several years ago, and she was a brilliant student, and she moved in 2003 to WHO to take an important position there. This is an American study conducted both in HIV and in another immune suppressed group of persons, the solid organ transplant. Persons with HIV are more likely, according to this study, which was conducted early in the beginning of the pandemic, to have a more severe disease which require mechanical ventilation or ECMO. It's a particular type of ventilation, especially those who had a lower level of CD4 positive cell below 350. And HIV positive status, these are Kaplan-Meier, indicate an increased risk at day 20 mortality in hospitalized patients for COVID. Which are, according to this WHO report in July 2021, the risk, it was possible to identify some subcategories of a person living with HIV at higher risk of worse prognosis. A person age above 65-year-old, male gender, with diabetes, with hypertension. At variance, there is these studies which indicate that HIV status was not associated with an incident SARS-CoV-2 infection, and this risk of transmission or infection was more linked to a young age, African origin, or being overweight. According to this study, I have said initially that I have produced and comment the majority of the studies that have enough numbers to make a comment and to be presented, but we do not have the final answer regarding if HIV make COVID infection worse or not. I would say that is the case mix, and the approach of therapy, in particular heart, that could make the difference and the degree of immune suppression. According to this study, very easy to understand, looking at the Kaplan-Meier probability in terms of mortality, ICU admission, need for mechanical ventilation are equally distributed among HIV positive and HIV negative individuals. A systematic review, a meta-analysis, which is probably more, I would say, I believe more to these meta-analyses because these are the result of many studies, indicate that HIV have an increased risk of hospital admission for COVID-19. and HIV also should be independently in a multivariant analysis associated with an increased risk of mortality. However, this is the caveat. These data have been obtained. I will just pass, since I'm running short of time, the data from this meta-analysis only from 2 studies, very large studies, randomized clinical trials. However, 2 studies weight from the part of HIV as making the prognosis much more worse. An important issue is prevention. Preventive measure can significantly reduce the burden of co-infection and can also reduce the possible occurrence of opportunistic disease. One issue which is responsible and is not related strictly to HIV is the onset of variant. You probably remember that with the exception of the so-called Italian variant and UK variant, but this can be also independently from the geographic place, is why the variant are present, for example, in India, in South Africa. At least 2 or 3 variants emerge in South Africa because there is a prolonged SARS-CoV-2 replication in person with advanced HIV. Omicron, it seems to be the result of a long replication which has occurred in an HIV positive individual, is not the one that I am presenting in this case. And the longer is the replication, the more frequent and the possibility of the onset of mutation. And if the mutation are extremely helpful to the virus for the replication or in terms of transmission or severity of disease, this variant become predominant, as this is what has occurred with the variant of concern, the so-called VOC, and we have Alpha, Delta, Omicron. In this case, the long replication, which lasted for 206 days, allow the emergence of multiple spike gene mutation, and I put in yellow those who are much more significant in terms of increasing the transmissibility and the immune evasions. Since we are addressing these issues in all the world, and we know that in the world there is also the presence of TB. So we have the colliding syndemics of HIV, TB, and COVID-19. And the number clearly indicate how big is the extent of each of these diseases, these infections. And speaking of the burden of COVID-19, since we have also to look at the remaining part of the world, not only to Europe, not only to Italy, to Europe, to the US, we should consider that TB provide a high risk factor in terms of severity and mortality, irrespective of HIV status. This how it looks at the map of Africa. I have a great experience. I've been several times in Africa. We still have missions in Tanzania, not in the same place of Casa Rosetta, but in Ikonda. We have also mission in Uganda. We used to have mission in Ghana. So I know how dramatic is the coincidental of 3 epidemics, HIV, TB, and malaria. And with the addition of COVID-19 starting from 2020. COVID-19 increased the susceptibility in TB patients. In other words, TB patients are at high risk of getting the infection of COVID-19. These studies, again produced in South Africa, indicate that the mortality risk was similar irrespective of viremia. But if we look at HIV alone and TB-associated COVID-19 mortality, we see that there is a higher risk if we look at those patients who have the dual infection, COVID-19, the HIV and TB in presence of COVID. Preliminary results were obtained in order to answer to the question whether or not the vaccine could be effective in immune-suppressed individuals. And data obtained in this article, in this research, suggested that inadequate immune reconstitution on heart could hinder the immune response to SARS-CoV-2. In other words, it's important to have a good reconstitution, to have a person who take regularly the highly active antiretroviral therapy in order to ensure a good response to vaccinations. HIV does not seem to negatively impact on COVID-19. And this is an important result. The immune response to COVID-19 vaccine in person living with HIV is identical to those who does not have this infection. But I am referring again to person immune suppressed, to person regularly antiretroviral therapy. And in uncontrolled HIV, on the contrary, variants, there is not such a good response. You see, in viremic HIV, they do not respond to first and second dose. So it's not a matter of the vaccine, but it's a matter of the immune system of the host. The breakthrough infections can occur in almost all vaccinated individuals. All of us know a person who got 2, 3, 4 shots and they become positive, they are nasal swab positive. And these breakthrough infections are more common in persons living with HIV in respect to persons without HIV. However, it's equally important to provide a better immune, in order to provide a better immune response and a higher immune response in person living with HIV. In other words, the vaccine should be given not in only 2 doses, but having the 3rd dose. I would say that if we look at the schedule of COVID-19, we should say 3 doses. Otherwise, the vaccine is not so effective. This is a series of slides that I can make a very brief comment in a general way to say that 1 dose is not enough to reach a high level of protection. On the contrary, giving the 3rd dose, this level of protection is increased. It's much more durable in terms of total binding antibodies against the receptor binding domain. And in particular, the level of neutralizing activities. Let me just open just another space. I have received several times the question, I have thousands of antibodies in my blood, am I protected? And I always answer quoting the CDC, what the CDC wrote and declared in May 2021, saying is not the number, the amount of antibodies, but the quality of antibodies. In other words, to have thousands of antibodies does not mean that we have neutralizing antibodies. And sometimes we observe the breakthrough infections in those who have been vaccinated or are recovering from or recovered from a previous COVID-19 infection, because probably the quality of antibodies was not enough to neutralize the virus, especially the new Omicron variants, which is extremely immune evasive. We can skip these, which is a repetition again, in order to save time. Another question, another important issue is the symptoms. In this case, the overall self-reported symptom locally or systemically observed are different in HIV seropositive in respect to HIV seronegative. And the answer is no. Actually, the symptoms observed after vaccination, in general, we now refer mostly to mRNA vaccine, either Moderna or Pfizer are virtually the same. This is something that probably could be interesting. There are 8 epitopes, 8 parts of the spike, which are present either in naturally occur infection, but more important in vaccine, which are highly preserved. And these 8 epitopes are the one which are stimulated and which stimulate the T cell response. You know, the humoral response is the one which avoid us the infections, protect us from the infection. The T cells which protect us from hospitalization, intensive care unit, and ultimately death. And probably you have seen that there is a big and remarkable difference if we look at what has occurred in the first wave, the one of 2020, and the second up to the Delta wave compared to Omicron. In Omicron, we have a large number of people vaccinated or which have acquired the infection or hybrid immunity, infection plus vaccination. And there has been 100,000 infection a day and very few hospitalization, very few admission in intensive care unit. Right now, we have 2.5%, or the last Italian National Institute of Health report indicate 2.5% admission in intensive care unit in respect to an increasing number of infections. And this is due to the T cell response. And legitimate question is how this response has changed in nowadays in presence of the Omicron variant, which is, I would say, a new virus. I cannot say this, but has more than 50 mutations in the spikes. So the Omicron is extremely immune evasion. There is not such a strong protection, does not provide a strong protection, the vaccine against Omicron. However, these 8 epitopes has not changed, at least 4 of them. And these 4 epitopes which has not changed are the so-called wall which protect us in presence of also the new variant which will eventually derive in this Omicron soup. The potential reason, and this is just one initial summary: immunodeficiency, immune dysregulation, comorbidities, and especially the social determinants of health. I would say that as a take-home message, the risk of increased severity and deaths from COVID depends on clinical settings. For example, in South Africa, we could observe different issues and different prognosis in respect to what we observe here in Italy. However, further studies are needed. There are collateral damage. The collateral damage, for example, there is an increase of HIV mortality there will be by 40% in 2020. What Dr. Cigna referred was possible, a wish, I would say, that by the year 2030, HIV was somehow stopped. However, COVID has produced a setback, an important setback in this possibility. And what has happened? There has been fewer tests produced, fewer HIV diagnoses, and fewer HIV viral load tests performed. I don't know if I have time. You will tell me. I have some slide. What is the Italian situation? In 2020, 1770 new case of infection has been recorded, which is a very good number. However, and it's written in this report, we should also consider the difficulties in diagnosis in presence of the COVID-19 pandemic. There is a decrease, for example, in the PrEP. PrEP is the post-exposure prophylaxis. See, there is a lapse. There has been severe disruption in health service due to several factors. We had our outpatient clinic closed during the lockdown. We had not observed major problem, but however, in other parts of the world, this problem has been observed. There has been several articles which indicate what has happened during the lockdown, for example. You know, there are several aspects such as suspension of service, HIV testing, no new heart initiation, and so on. And according to this mathematical model, the effects of disruption will largely disappear, if not by year 20 and 25, if there is not the appearance of a more aggressive variant that will produce more difficulties in handling COVID-19. I do not expect that this will occur. We will have a greater transmissibility of the Omicron variants with final S, which make more transmittable, but we will have a more severe flu with a more number of individuals infected, but it will be this, I think, the future scenario. Equality is the call to equality is what has been the mantra of this World AIDS Day 2020, because equality, this equality has been exacerbated among people living with HIV. And not only, studies published in JAMA a few weeks ago that I have commented for the website of La Stampa, an Italian newspaper, indicated that to be Afro-American, there was more chance to to have hospitalization, to receive less antiviral therapy, and to be admitted in intensive care unit, and have a larger number of deaths. These are the health inequities which that are common to HIV and COVID-19. It's a sort of a double stigma. This morning, I had a radio interview telling me if something was changed in terms of stigma for HIV. I would say yes and no. All that is related to a sexual aspect, starting from syphilis, there is always a sort of stigma independently of HIV. However, for COVID-19 and people infected, double infected with COVID-19 and HIV could produce an increased possibility for this stigma. There is a learning lesson, learned from COVID-19 pandemic for HIV. First of all, we still lack the idea of having an HIV vaccine. We had the HIV vaccine in a few months. When the genome of COVID-19 has been published by the Chinese scientists on January the 9th, immediately it started the run to get the vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, the viral vector vaccine, the protein vaccine, the inactivated virus vaccine. However, we still lack the vaccine, and we probably need a common effort in terms of biomedical research, change the behavioral. This is a sort of, in other words, comment for Professor Sani regarding how is the impact on AIDS and COVID in terms of mental distress.
Professore,
sì.
mi scusi, volevo segnare un attimino il tempo. So
Sì, ma
che sta concludendo.
io ho un problema, che ci vuole un minuto ogni diapositiva. Questo is not my fault. I made it's true, but every slide, the change of slides, it take 10 seconds or 15 seconds. This is an issue that I am not responsible. Okay, it was the last slide because I can easily skip these slides in Italian, and those who are interested, they easily find in the web the data. You see, now just to tell you, change now. Okay, there was something not working with this, or I was not enough capable in handling the passage from one slide to the other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I apologize for having stopped you. I'm usually a chairman. There's a sort of delay in between the slides. At the beginning, I even thought I was pressing the wrong button. You've fulfilled your duty. When I'm a chairperson, you need to be very severe, very strict with the speakers who are not complying with time. I had the watch here with me. I knew I was going to be long. But I had no control on the technical issue. Thank you very much, Professor Cowd. Thank you very much for your considerations. And now, then at the end, we'll draw some conclusions on your presentation and the one that will be made by Professor Sani. Now, the floor to Mr. De Cristoforo, our journalist, who's going to ask questions to Professor Cauda.
Sì, grazie. Sono arrivate diverse domande, quelle come dire, più interessanti che vedo.
C'è un rimbombo, Enrico.
Sì, non so perché.
Devi abbassare l'audio.
Si sente? Perfetto.
microfono.
No, c'è qualcosa che... Non dipende da me.
Interpretation.
Ecco, forse va meglio. Ecco, perfetto. Allora, dicevo, sono arrivate diverse domande. Niente.
Tu hai due computer accesi, Enrico?
Sì, c'è un altro computer, però è chiuso.
Devi spegnerne uno.
Sì, vediamo. Allora, vediamo un attimo. Perché?
Please, can you make sure you're not connected on another device? Check.
Ok, forse abbiamo risolto.
Are you on a phone?
Sei collegato col telefono?
No, with C, ok. Ho trovato il problema, ecco, qual era... Va bene, si sente così?
Sì.
Perfetto, scusate, ho capito. Dicevo, sono state mandate diverse domande. Ne ho prese qualcuna, ecco, una ragazza di Caltanissetta, di un liceo qui di Caltanissetta, chiede intanto se le persone con HIV devono adottare comportamenti particolari nei confronti dell'infezione Covid-19 e poi se una persona minorenne può effettuare il test HIV senza il consenso dei genitori.
Okay, there are two questions from a grammar school, from a student grammar school in Caltanissetta. Should people with HIV, could you repeat the question, Enrico, because I wasn't writing. Puoi ripetere la domanda, la prima domanda, farlo una volta.
Sì. Allora, le persone con HIV devono adottare comportamenti particolari nei confronti dell'infezione Covid-19?
Okay. Should people with HIV assume particular precautions in front of the COVID infection? That's the first question. And the second question, la seconda domanda?
Una persona minorenne può effettuare il test HIV senza il consenso dei genitori?
A person who is not 18, can she have an HIV test without the permission of her parents? And these are the two questions which we're asking Professor Cauda.
Okay, I will answer in English. The first question is crucial, I would say. We are not only related to HIV individuals, but also to immune suppressed individuals in general, because they are at higher risk of getting infections. However, no one is, everybody is at risk of getting the infection. So in presence of immune suppressed individuals, probably not just HIV individual, because if they are vaccinated, they are protected in a similar, identical way as the non-HIV individual. What is important is it's a general rule which is effective for all type of a person when there are a large number of individuals in crowdness. Is it possible, is it necessary, I would suggest, to wear mask, and also, this is important to remember, that to to get the vaccination. Initially, there was a big debate whether it was important to vaccine the HIV, or was possible to vaccine because there was the fear of a possible side effect. But now is crystal clear that the people should receive 3 vaccination and 4 with the new updated bivalent vaccine, updated for Omicron via 4 and via 5.
Puoi tradurre?
No, professor Cauda, le chiedo a lei di farsi la stessa risposta in italiano, perché non perché sono pigro, ma lei è un medico, io sono un professore in inglese. Dunque...
Ok, I will repeat. Perfetto. La seconda domanda, siccome riguarda soltanto l'Italia, la farò in italiano, anche perché, come sappiamo, c'è tutto il grande dibattito adesso, alcuni sono già scesi in campo. Allora, la prima domanda a cui ho risposto, di fatto, sì, soggetti immunodepressi, poi noi stiamo parlando di una costellazione di individui, cioè quello, la maggioranza sono tutte persone sotto terapia, quindi per le quali non dovremmo avere altra avvertenza rispetto ai soggetti non sieropositivi, e questo va detto, così come undetectable equal untransmissible, cioè il fatto che se uno non ha il virus non lo trasmette, dovremmo cominciare, anzi dovremmo continuare a considerare le persone che vivono con l'HIV del tutto uguale per quello che riguarda il rischio. Evidentemente potrebbe non essere lo stesso di persone magari che non hanno immuno ricostituito, non sono sotto terapia, devono essere veramente poche in Italia. Purtroppo in Italia c'è il sommerso, quel 14-15 mila persone sieropositive che non sanno di esserlo. E mi riaggancio a questo, non è ancora possibile per un minorenne fare il test, ma io mi auguro che presto lo diventi, perché è un modo per ridurre e per vivere questa malattia in maniera un pochettino più tranquilla. Io mi sono sempre battuto dal 1981 e ricordo Jonathan Mann dell'Università di Harvard che aveva impedito che questa malattia si chiamasse GAIDS, Gay Associated Immune Deficiency Syndrome. Sarebbe stato un disastro dal punto di vista comunicativo, ma un disastro dal punto di vista scientifico, perché non è che colpisce soltanto i gay.
Well, I'll just translate the second question, because the first was done in Italian and English. The second question, Professor Cauda is saying that obviously underage people cannot do the test without the parents' permission, but they should be able to in the future. Okay, this is important.
È auspicabile.
È auspicabile, sì. It's important. It should be something aspired to.
Should be changed the law. I mean, I think that the time is mature for this change.
Il tempo è maturo per un cambiamento nella legge per facilitare l'accesso a questi test anche ai minorenni.
Ok. Grazie professore, thank you very much. And, pensavo, Enrico, che potevamo chiudere questa sessione e poi ne riprendiamo una finale di domande e risposte con il professor Sani. C'era qualche altra domanda?
Sì, però possiamo magari farla alla fine. Ce n'è un'altra, dico così.
Ce n'è un'altra, facciamola allora. Sì, se c'è un'altra domanda.
Sì, ce ne sono diverse, però dico, ne prendo un'altra così, ecco. Sì. In che modo i pazienti affetti da HIV che avevano il Covid-19 si sono ripresi, affrontano attualmente la condizione appunto dell'HIV?
This is an interesting question, and I will remember that since we are living the Omicron era, there's been an article published, I think, in Lancet a few months ago. It's important because we are now touching that this article was true. In the people affected by Omicron has a lesser chance of being affected by long COVID. The long COVID is a new syndrome that has a very wide range of symptoms, from foggy brain to cardiovascular cardiovascular disease, shortness of breath, fatigue. Fatigue is the hallmark of long COVID. I would say that if they were young, people with HIV, person living with HIV, had no problem in their convalescence stage, and they had nothing in particular, no difference in particular with person without HIV. They had the same risk of long COVID, reduced today for the presence of Omicron. And it was important, and we stress a lot this issue, to convince the person to take regularly their heart therapy. La traduco io in italiano? Perfetto.
Sì, chiedo gentilmente al professore di farlo, sì, grazie.
Dunque, il rischio di, come è stato detto in un articolo di Lancet, e che noi abbiamo avuto la possibilità in qualche modo di verificare, è ridotto. Il long Covid è una sindrome nuova che coinvolge praticamente tutti gli organi, e un Covid che dura non certamente come nella fase acuta, ma per oltre 6 mesi. Questo è il primo aspetto. Noi, nella mia esperienza, nella nostra esperienza, non è che l'HIV, una volta superato, aveva un rischio maggiore di long Covid rispetto ai non HIV positivi, e questa è una buona notizia. L'unico rischio che però noi non abbiamo verificato, siamo molto stati attenti, abbiamo molto stressato, e abbiamo questa alleanza terapeutica con le persone che vivono con l'HIV, di non interrompere la terapia antiretrovirale. Del resto ricorderete che inizialmente c'era stato un tentativo di reposing, cioè di riconsiderare l'opinavir ritonavir come terapia del Covid, o come la clorochina che potesse essere efficace per il Covid.
Grazie, professore. No, Rosario? Possiamo passare? Mi sentite? Mi sentite?
Sì, sì,
Rosario? Ok,
sì, va bene. Continuiamo, quindi il professor Cauda ha toccato un tema, come dicevo nella presentazione, che ci tocca e ci ha toccato da vicino. La stessa cosa vale per la relazione che terrà il professor Gabriele Sani, cioè che ci parlerà dei sintomi e delle sindromi psichiatriche in persone che fanno uso di sostanze. Ecco, questo problema noi lo riscontriamo all'interno delle comunità alloggio per persone con problemi di HIV/AIDS per via della storia pregressa legata alle dipendenze patologiche, ma anche e soprattutto all'interno delle nostre comunità terapeutiche, dove vivono persone che hanno fatto uso e abuso di sostanze psicotrope. Ecco, ci illumini, professore.
Intanto illuminarvi è difficile, perché ci ha già illuminato il professore Cauda, che ringrazio per la sua presentazione. Ringrazio il dottor Cigni ovviamente per la presentazione e il presidente per l'invito, e ringrazio molto da vicino il professor Cauda, perché tra le tante cose importanti che ha detto, spero che si veda. Mi date un segno? Ma penso di sì, giusto?
Among the important things mentioned by Professor Cauda, the important thing mentioned by him is paramount importance, which is the approach to normalization, i.e. treat this disease as a normal disease. This means getting out of a sign that make us consider some patients as if they were different from others, as if there were reasons independent of the medical ones, the category of morals, or what is right, wrong, of sin. This misinterpretation on these patients is something which has involved HIV positive patients living with AIDS, and which still concerns individuals with substance use disorders. We should be able to speak about these diseases in normal ways, and having with these patients, with these individuals, an ethical approach, a welcoming approach, and which is with no bites, as some in the 80s called that gates. It would have been a disaster, and sometimes pre-judgments are not seen through words, but also through behaviors. Let's try and get out of this approach because it is not useful or correct. When we talk about substance use, we are talking about the use of psychotrope, psychoactive substances, cannabis, amphetamines, ecstasy, and others. We should open a small parenthesis here, which is cannabis, because many people speak about cannabis in Italy and other parts of the world. As I said at the beginning, doctors shouldn't have a prejudgment as for legalization, non-legalization of drugs. I think we should be independent, but we should say how things are. If lawmakers, legislators decide to legalize or non-legalize it, it's okay. But speaking about cannabis as a soft drug, the concept of weakness associated to cannabis does not exist, and this should be clarified. Still today, there are many individuals dying because of these substances, such as tobacco users. Alcohol is another big issue. Why am I dwelling on these things? They do not seem to be connected to opioids or injections. I'm doing this because they're connected to polymorbidity. Professor Cigna was speaking about comorbidity and substances such as alcohol, marijuana, especially when you are very young, and I'm referring to people who are 11 or 12. I have weekly experiences when I see very young patients coming with substance use disorders. They may have a polymorbidity, which is wider, and often they use also a combination of substances. Injecting a drug use in the 80s, we know heroin in the 80s killed many people, and this is decreasing all over the world, even though over the past 5 to 10 years, both in the United States, in Europe, and Italy, we've seen an increase in the use of opioids, also by injections. And this is still an issue because about 22% of people using heroin for the first time, they do it through injections. on the analysis of substances found in syringes used. We do not just see heroin, opioids, but other things, amphetamines, heroin, cocaine, synthetic catinones, or prescribed opioid medications and other medicines. This is a cocktail which is injected. It increases the danger of acute intoxication, therefore issues soon after absorbing that and then craving, and then make the medical approach more difficult because managing craving in polypharmacological abuse is more complicated than managing stabilization and craving in a single drug, methadone, which is effective in stabilization in some patients, is less effective when individuals are using more than one drug. More than 50% of studied syringes had 2 or 3 concomitant drugs. In Italy, about 6,000 people die in the world, 16.7 deaths per million. Polydrug toxicity is very frequent. Benzodiazepines are commonly used, and opioids are present in 3/4 of all drug-induced deaths. As you can see, the problem of drug addiction is a medical problem for the extension of the issue, which concern many conditions. They require a multidisciplinary approach. The psychiatrist, internal medicine doctor, pneumologist, gastroenterologist, all are professionals, because each organ of the individual undergoes acute and permanent damages for the use of these substances. So psychologists, doctors, rehabilitators are involved. Then it is also a social issue, and it's an alarming issue.
L'approccio un po'
Then prejudgment for these conditions. This is an interview which was carried out with chemical operators by experts in the field, according to biological, psychological willingness for a set of psychiatric disorders. I'm speaking about mania. We know what mania is. Sometimes you have severe clinical condition, a narcissistic disorder, where people need to be at the center of attention, and then there are personal and working relationships revolving around personal advantages. The interesting thing is that while as for mania, there is an agreement of people in identifying themselves as a biological condition. It's seen as a biological condition. In narcissistic personality disorder, this is seen as a psychological disorder. In the addiction disorder, there is an overlapping of all judgments. The experts who see it as a biological condition, some others as a psychological condition, and some others as a disorder of willingness, which means they're doing it because they want to do that, and if they didn't want to do that, they wouldn't be doing that. You understand there is a big confusion on that, and this is mirrored on the diagnostic framing and the rehabilitation therapeutic approach. As Dr. Cigna was saying before, those working in community centers, they are well aware people with HIV have a past with drug addiction, and experts dealing with these people and individuals themselves have gone through this lack of clarity as opposed to the pathology they was suffering, because not only do we know that you cannot choose, you can try to take care of yourself, but when you have a substance use disorder, you cannot decide out of the blue to stop it and then the following day you are okay. So getting away from this condition is something quite painful and difficult. Often people do not just see you as someone with a disease, but they see you as someone who is a victim of their own choices. And therapeutic rehabilitation process is complicated. Actually, this is a disorder with clear clinical conditions which have been clearly described and defined, and it's not based on the presence of whims, so to say. It is a craving a specific condition, a dysfunctional social relational condition to be seen in its overall frame. What is certain, and these data confirmed by evidence from literature all over the world, there are several factors leading to etiology and pathogenesis of these disorders. Genetic proneness, predisposition is clear. It's not a Mendelian process. If the father is so, the son will be like this as well. However, we see in the family of people using substances, well, this is quite frequent. In 80% of cases, there is a form of addiction. The object of addiction is not the same. If someone is abusing with heroin, other first-degree relatives use heroin. Some others may have substance use disorders related to alcohol, behavioral disorders which have the same neurobiological matrix, and also maybe the same social substrate. And when I'm speaking about behavioral addiction, I'm speaking about gambling, for instance. This is quite frequent also in the cases of patients who have parents with workaholic, who are workaholic. It is functionally more acceptable, but from the clinical viewpoint, it has all the characteristics of behavioral addiction. there are some early stresses, social issues such as attachment to the family, which goes on even with the passing of years, and then traumas during childhood, social disorders, problems at school, and social difficulties. Genetics is important, but as you can see in this graph, the parental support makes up for the high genetic risk in the families where parental supporting is high. There is no difference as for the increase in substance use disorder between those with high and low genetic risk. This difference is dramatically significant in those family households where parental support is low. So genetics and the environment, we know this is true for any medical milieu, but in this case it is very, very striking. There are also alterations and disruptions in responses to stresses, and this is likely due to a cortisol response, which is genetically determined, and this is another element where when there is too much response, which is dysregulated to external stimuli, there is an increase in the risk of developing substance use disorders. Unpleasant things in life occur frequently when there is a short circuit between genetic and social conditions. The risk of developing addictions is very high. Then without getting into detail, because we do not have much time, this is just to share with you the fact that major areas were identified in the addition circuit, the frontal orbital areas in our brain, supervising the inhibitory condition, thalamus, amygdala, the anterior cingulate circle, involved in the emotional response to stimulation. We know this from magnetic resonance studies, where there are disrupted responses in these circuits in patients with substance use disorders. This provides confirmation for the fact that there is an underlying pathology that in pathogenesis has a neurobiological basis which is evident and clear. This is the reward circuit. We shouldn't forget that all substances, all behaviors that in a certain way can give rise to addiction disorders are the same substances or behavior that can lead to a sense of pleasure. If we think about alcohol, not everybody drinking alcohol develops addiction to alcohol. However, all those drinking alcohol enjoy drinking it or have a sense of pleasure. So the wanting and liking circuit are overlapping but not the same. The liking is part of a structure of the nucleus accumbens related also to wanting, which means that if all the things we do diet for pleasure, and because we also want it, which is the red part highlighted here, the nucleus accumbens. Not all the things we do because we want to do is something we also like. When we have an addiction and we need to take it because of craving, it does not mean that using of substance is something we like. Those using heroin are looking for that initial pleasure. But this does not mean that each time they're using heroin and they really like it. Patients speak of disliking because in that moment they cannot do without that. They see they are addicted, so they dislike that. This is what happens in our brain. There are many tools to make a correct diagnosis. These are specialized tools that can be used in different settings, in community outreach settings to assess addiction disorders and assess the trend through time. Speaking about drug using screening tests, scales such as ASI, so on and so forth. Let's move to substance use disorders and psychiatric comorbidity. The concept of comorbidity is quite an unusual concept in psychiatry. When speaking about comorbidity, as far as the studies in the United States were carried out, we should have two diseases with two different pathogeneses developing at the same time in the same individuals. This is a real comorbidity. In psychiatric disorders, we cannot say it for sure because we do not know the causes of the pathologies in questions. If we speak about comorbidity or dual diagnosis when we have a psychiatric disorder or substance use disorders, let's think about personality disorder and cocaine use. These are not two distinct pathologies. Are these with a common etiology and two clinical manifestations which are apparently different, or one is maybe the result of another, where you have a primary condition and a secondary condition? Well, this is an open field where globally they're talking extensively. And to be simple and quick, we keep using this concept to say that comorbidity is the rule and not the exception. It's nearly impossible to see a patient with a substance use disorder and does not have bipolar conditions, anxiety, and similar other disorders or conditions. At least in Italy, it's difficult to hospitalize someone suffering from substance use disorder. Drug addicts shouldn't be hospitalized with psychiatric patients. Often, substance use disorder individuals have a concomitant prevailing or coexisting psychiatric disorder. We should change our mindset and hospitalize these individuals too. However, this is the rule and not the exception. This is what I was telling you before. Hypotheses that can lead to this dual vision. biological vulnerability, which is common, a diagnosis to specific diagnosis that meet and develop psychiatric comorbidity. However, this does not mean that one comes before the other one and vice versa. This sometimes can be the manifestation in two different conditions from the same disease. The self-medication idea, where people start abusing because of psychological disorders, they start using substances that can relax them, such as heroin, or those who want to alleviate depression and hyperactivity, they use cocaine, alcohol for their anxiety and depression relief. And this is something that invites us to receive the concept of comorbidity. So dual diagnosis leads to double trouble. If there are patients with psychiatric disorders, they may have social issues, social problems if they didn't have the basic psychiatric condition. Then each type of psychiatric condition gets worse when there is an increase the adding of substance use disorders. There's an increased risk of suicide. There is an increase of finding psychiatric pathologies in individuals using substances, and people who have some conditions such as anxiety. And if you look at the same thing from the opposite end, individuals with psychiatric disorders show up to 5-fold increase So from any side you look at the situation, you see there's a risk of increasing the manifestation of the other disease, but the disorder is clear. In bipolar disorder, this is quite frequent in maniac conditions, acute conditions, depressive conditions with self-medication, where there is a worsening of another severe psychiatric condition, which is schizophrenia, in all patients using substances, complication which is worsened by the fact that there is an increased risk of lack of compliance. These patients are not compliant, so they relapse. Then HIV AIDS patients. Professor Cauda made a reference to this. Their transmission has changed over the past years. Intravenous drug users have decreased. The heterosexual transmission have increased. MSN have increased too. This is the trend of the past years. This is a snapshot of 2020. These are smaller numbers. 17% decrease from the previous year. This data is biased by the difficulty in detecting the condition because of pandemic. 30,000 new cases in 2020. MSM accounted for 71% of new HIV diagnoses. People who acquired HIV through heterosexual contact made up 22%, and people who reject drugs accounted for 7%. and transgender people accounted for approximately 2%. This is the result of an awareness-raising campaign, and it is a normal pathology which have a normal medical approach, otherwise we run the risk of not conveying the right message. In patients with HIV and AIDS, we have a twofold increase of depression, a fourfold increase of panic, generalized anxiety disorder, tenfold increase of bipolar disorder, and 2 to 10-fold increase of schizophrenia. This means risk behaviors that can be connected to psychiatric conditions, previous psychiatric condition. Then prevention has to be mentioned. If we want to keep decreasing the number of people acquiring HIV, an awareness raising campaign is important for prevention and referring to risk factors. Among these is psychiatric conditions, so a sort of sharing, collaboration, sharing of knowledge, social communication strategies which are essential to win this battle. Depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders among the highest. These entail higher risk and more difficult treatment in the medium and long term. Personality disorders for patients suffering from substance use disorders and also have HIV because of the use of substances, they have this cluster B diagnosis. It does not mean that patients are borderline antisocial. These patients must be properly approached and treated for a long-term effect. As for therapies, our pathologies in this case can be treated well with medications. The pharmacokinetics is very important. For ART, antipsychotic drugs, antidepressive drugs, antidepressants are important. We need to choose the right medications also according to the metabolizable medications. Antipsychotics are used, mood stabilizers. Mood stabilizers are important. Lithium is a medication which is often not taken into consideration in these patients because they say it must be used constantly, regularly, you need to perform tests. This is all true. But however, lithium does not have any pharmacokinetic interaction as it happens with other ART medications. We've been treating patients with a long history. They need to be stabilized through time. It is medication which I call an anti-historical medication because in the time factor we have therapeutical element, and I need to sometimes think about a medication that works very quickly. A dose using opioids, cocaine or heroin, they think that once they take a tablet, they can solve the problem. This is why lithium is not taken into consideration, because it requires time. It is a medication that works slowly. It works without even realizing that it's acting. This is a patient speaking about lithium after 1 month. He says that lithium is not working. I mean, you take lithium without realizing its action, but it's working, even though it's working slowly. It's easier to use benzodiazepines because you see the effect. Lithium stabilizes very well if there are depressions or bipolar disorders, and it can have a secondary advantage on addictions. They do not interact with antiretroviral medications. It must be checked on the blood test and monitored, but this is part of the game. Each type of therapeutic approach to a complex patient, we're speaking about really complicated pathologies, even 3 or 4 coexistent pathologies. They need a close cooperation with all the professionals. The relationship with the professionals is at the basis, is the background of the treatment and cure relationships. It's not a problem if individuals are invited to undergo blood tests and other things. So when we speak about customized therapy, we are referring to developing an armamentarium with all medications, the approach to the change of the ecosystem to get to a durable stabilization through time. These are my take-home messages, things I've already mentioned. I do not want to take other time, and I hope I have been clear. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sani. Thank you for a beautiful presentation. I've been taking notes from both Professor Cauda and Professor Sani. While I have time to reorganize my notes, I give the floor to Enrico to manage the questions and answers to Professor Sani.
Vabbè. Non so che vedete voi nel mio schermo.
No, la vediamo, noi la vediamo.
Noi la vediamo.
Vabbè, non vedo niente, ho perso la... Non importa, mi sento bene però.
Provi nell'icona in basso, ci deve essere l'icona di GoToMeeting.
Sentite? Rosario, mi sentite?
Sì, sì. Può essere si sia chiusa. Prego.
Rosario, mi senti?
Sì, sì.
Ah, ok, no, pensavo di aver perso il microfono. Ok, sì. No, volevo dire grazie veramente al professore Sani di questa relazione importantissima. Volevo soltanto dire che l'aspetto biologico e la predisposizione genetica è poco studiata, però varrebbe la pena di approfondire anche alla luce delle nuove evidenze di tipo epigenetico rispetto appunto al problema dell'abuso di sostanze. Enrico, vuoi Hai visto qualche domanda in particolare o ne hai tu qualcuna?
Ci sono anche qui diverse domande, ecco, ne ho prese qualcuna. Ecco, in merito alla comorbidità tra uso di sostanze e le conseguenze psichiatriche che esse possono causare, come avviene questo passaggio, mi chiedono. Poi ce n'è un'altra che forse si interseca.
On the use and abuse of substances, I mean, is this the cause of psychiatric disorders, or is it psychiatric disorders that lead to the abuse of substances? As I said before, it's very difficult to understand what comes first. In the classical psychopathological approach, we had the primary pathologies and the secondary pathologies. The approach is DSM approach, counting symptoms and then leading to the making of diagnosis. We cannot ask ourselves because we do not know the primary etiopathogenetic basis. It is like a vicious circle. When you know the psychiatric pathology and the abuse of substances, you know that both of them complicate each other. We need to solve both of them. You cannot solve or act on only one of them. Is there any other question? A question for both speakers. Many wonder, in the chat they were saying, in the past, even through mass media, there was a lot of prevention. There were many prevention campaigns on AIDS, and science has made important steps forward. Why there is not a massive prevention as they used to do in the past? There are sexually transmissible diseases such as AIDS or other diseases such as papillomavirus, which are not quite common or known by the youth and the adults. So why there is not prevention as they used to organize in the past? Who would like to answer? Maybe Professor Cauda would like to answer. Screening in adolescents is an Italian issue. Professor Luigi Ortoni was the president, and I saw many different aspects, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. I don't know if you remember the purple color surrounding or circling people. TV news was speaking about what is happening. There were no medications available, and big criticism involving a lot of people, and then there was a big debate on yes and no. I think campaigns were organized, and these campaigns contributed. I don't think it's a question of campaigns. Before, I was referring to the fact that people are not scared of HIV or AIDS, just like people are not scared of COVID. The perception has changed. There is a mixed population. We have people with gray hair, and there are people who think who are not a risk, and then the use of cape sex, recreational drugs, which are used in Italy too. People have a lot of disinhibition. I do not have a big experience on this, because young people say, well, if you develop a disease or a condition, there is a treatment for that. This is why there is less inhibition on that. It's not just a problem of communication. If you look what is being broadcast in these days, in these hours, what the World AIDS Day is not properly highlighted. Maybe it's on the last page. I think we can stop here. Rosario, a couple of words. It's very difficult to make a summary, draw up a summary for the two presentations, because they were highly scientific, and they also provided the important suggestions and food for thought. Two important items for each speaker. The first one from Professor Cauda, when he was speaking about the efficacy of vaccines in HIV patients, how important it is to take the ART. Then I was thinking about the concept of choice, of having a precise treatment, and this is a relative concept in many areas in the world. The people cannot use correct ART because access to medications is not as easy as it is in our countries. Then racism, which develops when it comes to access to treatment. Professor Cauda mentioned less or more access to hospitalization according to your origin. That was a study referred to an overall situation. It was commented on healthcare system organization. Then, as for the presentation by Professor Sani, I was struck when he spoke about comorbidity as a regularity. I remember 10-15 years ago, in the framework of pathological additions, they were speaking about those things, and the comorbidity is something regular, common when it comes to the use of substances. Then a common thread for both presentations is the stigma highlighted by both speakers for HIV patients, drug addicts, and individuals with psychiatric disorders, as we've seen at the beginning with COVID. I'd like to thank all participants. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Rosario, for being short. When you mentioned stigma, you made me think about the perception of stigma by patients themselves, which is being studied by researchers internationally. They're speaking about this important observation because it's a sort of self-stigmatization they're studying. We need to stop, even though each comment and question is very interesting. I'd like to thank once again our speakers for having contributed to this international webinar. And I'll inform you about the number of participants connected, and also about the high number of participants who have been appreciating all your presentations. I'd like to thank Professor Cauda, Professor Sani. We do hope to have you here in presence in Sicily with us in other future events. We hope to propose to our associate members of ISSUP. We can conclude our webinar here. Thank you for participating and for being with us. I'd like to thank all colleagues, the working group, the international team of ISSUP. Olivia, thank you very much for this continuous technical assistance. I'd like to thank all participants. All participants will get a link to watch the recording of this webinar. On behalf of ISSUP Global and ISSUP Italy and all of us, see you on our next webinar at the beginning of next year. Thank you. Thank you. Enjoy your evening. Thank you. Thank you.